It started with something as trivial as a parking ticket. At least, that's what I thought at the time. A small yellow slip tucked under the windshield wiper of my wife's SUV, the kind of nuisance everyone deals with once in a while. It was a chilly Thursday morning when I found it. Allison, my wife, had already left for work. I was heading to my own office when I noticed her car parked at an odd angle in our driveway. That's when I saw the ticket, glaring up at me like it had something to prove. Illegal parking, it read. A hefty fine too. I made a mental note to talk to her about it later and moved on with my day, unaware that this little piece of paper would unravel everything I thought I knew about my life. Allison brushed it off when I mentioned it that evening. "Oh, yeah. I was in a rush last week," she said with a shrug. "I'll take care of it." There was something about her tone, too casual, too dismissive. But I let it go. A few days later, the fine came up again. I overheard her on the phone, her voice low but sharp. "Look, you said this would be quick. I don't have time for this to drag out." I paused outside the kitchen door, my ears pricking up. Was she talking to a lawyer? It seemed excessive for a parking fine, but I didn't push. I trusted her. Why wouldn't I? That night, Allison seemed distracted. She kept glancing at her phone during dinner, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. When I asked if everything was okay, she gave me a tight smile and said, "Work stuff. Nothing to worry about." The first crack in our perfect life. A week passed, and the parking ticket was all but forgotten. Or so I thought. Life went on in its usual rhythm, work, dinners at home, and quiet evenings on the couch. Allison seemed a little preoccupied, but I chalked it up to stress at her marketing firm. She had always been good at managing pressure, or so it seemed. Then, on a Wednesday afternoon, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. "Mr. Harris?" a formal voice asked. "Yes, speaking," I replied, already wary. "This is Thomas Grady, an attorney from Bennett and Grady Law. I'm representing your wife, Allison Harris, regarding a minor legal matter." "An attorney? For the parking ticket?" My stomach tightened. "I'm sorry," I said cautiously. "What exactly is this about?" "Just routine documentation," he replied smoothly. She asked us to expedite the resolution of her citation, given her busy schedule. "It's nothing to worry about." It sounded plausible, but something about the call didn't sit right with me. Allison hadn't mentioned hiring a lawyer, and she wasn't the type to go through such lengths for a simple fine. I thanked him and hung up, telling myself I was overthinking things. That evening, I brought it up casually over dinner. "Hey, I got a call from a lawyer today." "Something about your parking ticket?" For a split second, her fork froze midair. Then she recovered, placing it down with an air of practiced nonchalance. "Oh, yeah," she said, her tone light but deliberate. "The fine was more complicated than I thought. It was cheaper to have someone handle it for me." Cheaper? That didn't make sense. But Allison had a way of brushing things off that made you feel silly for even asking. I decided to let it go, but her response lingered in the back of my mind, scratching at my instincts like an itch I couldn't reach. A few days later, I came home early from work. Allison's car wasn't in the driveway, which wasn't unusual. She often worked late or ran errands after hours. But as I stepped into the kitchen, something caught my eye. Her laptop was open on the dining table. I hesitated for a moment. Allison was fiercely private about her devices, and I'd always respected that boundary. But my curiosity, fed by an increasing sense of unease, got the better of me. The screen displayed an email exchange. The sender's name stopped me cold, Thomas Grady. "Thanks again for meeting me today," one of Allison's messages read. "I appreciate everything you're doing to help clear this up." Meeting him? I scrolled further, my pulse quickening. The next email from Grady was even more unsettling. "Of course, Allison. Always a pleasure. Let me know when you're free for coffee again. Coffee? My stomach turned. Why was a lawyer casually meeting my wife for coffee over a parking ticket? I closed the laptop and sat down, my head spinning. Was I reading too much into this? Was there an innocent explanation, or had I just stumbled onto something darker? That evening, I couldn't stop replaying the details in my mind. The nervous glance at her phone. The slick attorney with his smooth words. The odd way she dismissed my questions, like she'd rehearsed the answers. When Allison came home later that night, I watched her closely. She seemed perfectly normal, laughing at a rerun of our favorite show, chatting about the annoying client she had dealt with that day. But the ease I once felt around her was gone. "Is everything okay?" she asked, catching me staring. "Yeah," I said too quickly. "Just tired." I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I knew one thing: something wasn't adding up. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into an abyss I didn't want to see. The following days were heavy with unspoken tension, though Allison didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she did and chose to ignore it. I couldn't tell anymore. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that the coffee meeting and emails were innocent. But every time I saw her smile, that nagging doubt whispered louder. One evening, as we sat down for dinner, her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at it and quickly flipped it face down. It wasn't the first time she'd done that, but now it felt deliberate, like she was hiding something. "Who was that?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. She hesitated, just for a second. "Work email," she said, forcing a smile. "It can wait." I nodded, pretending to believe her. But later that night, after she fell asleep, I found myself staring at her phone on the nightstand. I hated the idea of snooping, but the feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. I reached out, then stopped. What was I doing? This wasn't me, or us. The next day, I decided to take a different approach. "How's the parking ticket thing going?" I asked over breakfast, trying to sound uninterested. "It's fine," she said quickly, pouring coffee. "The lawyer's handling it." "Seems like a lot of work for a little fine," I pressed. She shrugged, her back to me. "It's just easier this way." Her tone ended the conversation, but the uneasy feeling didn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. The distance between us felt wider than the space in our bed. I stared at the ceiling, wondering if I was imagining things, or if I was losing the person I thought I knew. It wasn't until the following week that I decided I couldn't keep ignoring the feeling that something was off. Allison's behavior hadn't changed much. She still laughed at my jokes, still kissed me on her way out the door, but something about her felt distant, like she was somewhere else even when she was right in front of me. I needed answers. One afternoon, I came home early again, hoping to catch her off guard. Her car was in the driveway this time, and the muffled hum of voices drifted from the living room. At first, I thought she might be on a video call, but as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't a work meeting. The male voice was calm and smooth. "Don't worry about it," he was saying. "We'll figure it out." I froze, heart pounding. My feet moved on their own, carrying me toward the slightly ajar door. Through the crack, I saw her sitting on the couch, leaning slightly forward as if hanging on his every word. Across from her, a man sat with his back to me. Thomas Grady. I recognized him instantly from his firm's website, which I'd looked up after our phone call. He was well dressed, his posture relaxed. They weren't touching, but the way they were sitting, so close, so comfortable, felt intimate in a way that made my stomach churn. I stepped back quietly, retreating to the kitchen. My hands were shaking as I leaned against the counter, trying to piece together what I had just seen. Why was he here? What were they discussing? And why hadn't she mentioned it to me? I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I waited for him to leave, hiding in my car a block down the street. After about an hour, I saw him exit the house, his gait leisurely as if he had nothing to hide. He walked to a sleek black sedan parked near the curb and drove off without a second glance. When I returned to the house, Allison was in the kitchen, sipping a glass of wine like it was just another evening. She looked up and smiled as I walked in. "You're home early," she said, her tone light. I nodded, swallowing the questions threatening to spill out. "Yeah, slow day at work." We ate dinner in near silence that night. She didn't ask me about my day, and I didn't bring up Thomas Grady. But as I watched her across the table, a part of me already knew. This wasn't about a parking ticket. It never had been. Later, after she went to bed, I sat in the living room with my laptop, determined to find answers. I combed through her social media accounts, bank statements, even our shared calendar. At first, nothing stood out. But then I stumbled upon an email she'd forgotten to log out of, a chain with Grady, littered with vague references to meetings and discreet arrangements. One message caught my eye. "Thank you for being so understanding today. I know it's risky, but I trust you." Risky? Trust him with what? I stared at the screen, every instinct telling me this was bigger than I'd allowed myself to believe. Allison wasn't just hiding something, she was hiding someone. I closed the laptop, my mind racing. Whatever this was, it was about more than a lawyer and a ticket. And I was done playing along. The next morning, I couldn't shake the heaviness in my chest. The sight of Allison moving effortlessly through her morning routine, pouring coffee, humming to herself, felt surreal. How could she act so normal when everything between us felt anything but? "I'm meeting a client after work today," she said, grabbing her bag. "I'll be home late." She didn't meet my eyes as she spoke, and that small detail hit me like a slap. Client had become her favorite excuse lately. "Sure," I said, keeping my voice even. "Let me know if you need anything." She nodded, already halfway out the door. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space she'd left behind. I couldn't wait any longer. That evening, I drove to the address I'd seen in one of her emails to Grady, a quiet office building tucked away in the next town over. I parked a block away and waited. It wasn't long before her car pulled up, and I watched as she got out, smoothing her skirt before heading inside. Minutes felt like hours as I sat in the car, trying to decide what to do. Should I storm in and confront her? Wait for her to come out? The thought of what I might see made my stomach churn, but I couldn't leave. Not now. Just when I thought my nerves would get the better of me, the front door opened. Allison stepped out, followed closely by Grady. They were laughing, their voices low, and though they didn't touch, the ease between them was undeniable. My grip tightened on the steering wheel as I watched them linger by her car. He said something that made her laugh again, and then, finally, he turned and walked away. Allison stood there for a moment, watching him go before getting into her car and driving off. I didn't follow her home. I couldn't. Instead, I sat there in the dark, trying to process what I'd just seen. It wasn't physical, at least not that I could prove. But it was enough to confirm what I'd been afraid of all along: she had crossed a line, and our marriage might never recover. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her laughing with him, her body language so relaxed, so open. It was a side of her I hadn't seen in months, maybe years. The knowledge sat heavy in my chest, suffocating. By the time Allison got home, I had managed to calm myself, on the surface, at least. She breezed through the door with a cheery "Hey," and dropped her bag on the counter. "How was your day?" she asked, pouring herself a glass of wine like nothing was wrong. "It was fine," I replied, my voice steady. "How about you?" "Busy," she said casually, sipping her wine. That client meeting ran longer than I thought. There it was again. That lie. I clenched my fists under the table, fighting the urge to explode. But I knew better. I needed to handle this carefully. That lawyer, Thomas Grady, I said, watching her closely. He seems pretty involved in all of this parking ticket stuff. Her hand paused mid-air, the wineglass hovering just inches from her lips. Yeah, she said lightly. He's been really helpful. Helpful how? I pressed. Isn't a lawyer for something like this overkill? She finally set the glass down and met my gaze, her smile faltering. I just didn't want to deal with it myself, she said after a moment. What's with all the questions? I shrugged, leaning back in my chair. Just curious. It seems like you've been spending a lot of time with him. Her eyes narrowed, a flash of defensiveness crossing her face. You think I'm lying to you or something? I didn't say that, I replied evenly. But if there's something you're not telling me, now would be a good time. Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought she might actually tell me the truth. But then she stood, her voice sharp. I can't believe this. You're being ridiculous. With that, she stormed upstairs, leaving me alone at the table. The sound of her retreating footsteps echoed in my ears, each one driving the wedge between us deeper. I stayed up late, sitting in the dark with a single question swirling in my mind, when had things gone so wrong? The next day, I called in sick to work. If Allison wasn't going to give me answers, I'd find them myself. Armed with the information I'd gathered so far, the emails, the meeting addresses, the late nights, I decided it was time to dig deeper into her life. But the truth I was about to uncover would be far worse than I had imagined. The following morning, Allison left early, barely sparing me a glance as she grabbed her keys and muttered something about being late. I watched her car pull out of the driveway, a strange sense of finality settling over me. Today, I wasn't going to sit back and wonder. I was going to find out the truth. After she left, I opened her laptop. It was a long shot, she was usually careful, and I knew she deleted most of her correspondence. But luck was on my side. Her email was still logged in, the inbox filled with innocuous work messages at first glance. I scrolled past them quickly, searching for anything that stood out. Then I found it, an email chain with the subject line "Follow-up on our arrangement." My heart sank as I opened it. Thanks for making time yesterday, Grady's latest email read. I understand how complicated this situation is, and I'll do everything I can to make it go smoothly. Let me know if you want to discuss more in person. Complicated? Go smoothly. My hands trembled as I clicked through the chain, piecing together a timeline. The emails were vague, carefully worded, no doubt, but the pattern was unmistakable. She'd been meeting him regularly, and not just for legal advice. The most damning message was buried near the bottom, sent weeks earlier. I'm glad you trust me with this. It's important to protect yourself, no matter what happens next. You deserve to be happy. Protect herself? From what? And why was this lawyer so invested in her happiness? My stomach churned as I tried to make sense of it. The ambiguity of the emails only fueled my frustration, but one thing was clear, this wasn't just about a parking fine. I needed more than cryptic messages and suspicious meetings. I needed concrete evidence. That evening, when Allison came home, I pretended everything was normal. We had dinner, watched TV, and went to bed without incident. But I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with possibilities. The next morning, I decided to take things a step further. While Allison was in the shower, I grabbed her phone. My pulse quickened as I unlocked it, she still hadn't changed the passcode we'd shared for years. I scrolled quickly, searching for any messages or calls to Grady. And there it was. A message thread under a contact labeled TG. The messages were short and mostly logistical, meeting times, vague reassurances, but one stuck out. I can't wait to see you again. Yesterday was amazing. My grip tightened on the phone as I reread the words, each one cutting deeper than the last. This wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was real. My wife was having an affair. The sound of the shower shutting off jolted me out of my thoughts. I quickly placed the phone back on the nightstand and left the room, my heart pounding. When she came downstairs, smiling as if nothing had changed, I couldn't bring myself to look at her. The weight of what I knew was too much. Later that day, I called a private investigator. If I was going to confront her, I needed more than vague messages and my own suspicions. I needed undeniable proof. What I didn't realize was that the truth I was chasing would lead me to an even darker revelation, one that would shatter what little trust one had left. The private investigator, a sharp-eyed man named Scott, agreed to meet me the next day in his small, unassuming office. He asked for all the details, everything I had so far, from the emails to the meetings I'd tracked. I handed him the evidence, my heart heavy with the weight of what I was about to set in motion. Scott listened carefully, his pen scratching notes on a yellow pad. "If she's meeting this guy regularly, we'll get visual confirmation," he said. "Give me a week." I nodded, unsure whether I wanted him to succeed. A part of me still hoped this was a misunderstanding, that the messages were innocent and my imagination had filled in the worst. But deep down, I knew better. For the next few days, I tried to act normal. Allison seemed oblivious to the storm brewing around her, going about her routine as if nothing had changed. Her laughter at dinner, the casual kisses on her way out the door, it all felt hollow now, like a play she was performing while I sat in the audience, knowing the ending. Scott called me 3 days later. "We need to meet," he said simply. My stomach knotted as I drove to his office, my hands gripping the wheel until my knuckles turned white. When I arrived, he handed me a manila folder. "This is what you asked for," he said, his expression neutral. I opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were photos, grainy but clear enough to tell the story. Allison and Thomas Grady, sitting together at an outdoor cafe, their heads close as they talked. Another shot of them leaving his office, her hand brushing against his arm. The final photo was the hardest to look at, the two of them in the parking lot, her arms around his neck, their faces just inches apart. I stared at the images, my heart pounding in my ears. There was no more room for doubt. My wife was cheating on me. Scott cleared his throat. "There's more," he said, pulling out a USB drive. "Video from a hotel they checked into last night. I got the footage from a contact who works there. They were in the room for over 2 hours. I couldn't bring myself to take the drive." It was one thing to see photos, but watching her betrayal unfold in motion felt like too much. "That's enough," I said quietly, my voice shaking. "Thank you." On the drive home, the anger started to set in. The lies, the secrets, the ease with which she had deceived me, it all burned inside me. But beneath the anger was something worse, the ache of knowing the life we'd built together had been a lie. When I got home, Allison was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She looked up and smiled as I walked in. "Hey, how was your day?" she asked, her tone light. I stared at her, the folder still in my hand. "We need to talk," I said, my voice heavy with the weight of what was coming next. Her smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of unease. "About what?" I sat down across from her, placing the folder on the coffee table between us. "This." Her eyes widened as she opened it, the color draining from her face as she flipped through the photos. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "You tell me," I said coldly. "How long has this been going on, Allison?" She looked up at me, her eyes filling with tears. "It's not what it looks like," she said quickly. "I can explain." But her words rang hollow. I had seen enough. "Save it," I snapped. "I trusted you. I gave you everything. And this is what you've been doing." She started to cry, her excuses tumbling out in a desperate stream. But I wasn't listening. The truth was laid bare now, and there was no going back. This was the beginning of the end. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to clarity. Allison sat frozen, clutching the photos as though holding them tighter could make them disappear. Her tears streaked down her face, but I felt no sympathy. All I could see was the betrayal staring back at me from the evidence on the table. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said finally, her voice trembling. "It just happened." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "It just happened. You don't accidentally lie to your husband. You don't accidentally check into hotels with another man." She opened her mouth to respond but closed it again, as if searching for the right words. "It wasn't like that. I was just overwhelmed. The ticket, my work, everything. Thomas helped me figure things out." "Helped you?" I said, my voice rising. "By dragging you into bed? That's some legal advice." Her sobs grew louder, but I wasn't swayed. "Do you love him?" I asked, the question tearing itself out of me before I could stop it. "No," she said immediately, shaking her head. "It wasn't about that. I don't love him." Her answer, though immediate, didn't bring any relief. If anything, it made the betrayal feel worse. She had risked everything we built, not out of love but for something as shallow as convenience or comfort. I stood, pacing the room as she watched me, helpless. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I said, my voice shaking. "You've destroyed us, Allison." "I can't." I stopped, swallowing hard. The weight of my emotions was too much to bear. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered. "I didn't want to hurt you." I turned to her, my expression hard. "But you did. And there's no fixing this." The room fell silent, the words hanging in the air like a thundercloud. For the first time, Allison didn't try to argue. She simply lowered her head, the reality of her actions sinking in. "I'll pack a bag," she said quietly after a long pause. She stood and walked upstairs, her steps slow and heavy. I stayed where I was, staring at the photos on the table. Every part of me wanted to scream, to cry, to demand answers. But I was too exhausted to do any of it. By the time she came back down, a small suitcase in hand, I still hadn't moved. She paused at the door, her eyes searching mine for a flicker of forgiveness. There was none. As the door clicked shut behind her, the house felt emptier than ever. I collapsed onto the couch, my head in my hands. The silence was deafening, but I didn't fight it. I had no energy left to fight. I had survived the truth, but I wasn't sure what came next. The house felt unbearably quiet after Allison left. The emptiness wasn't just physical, it was emotional, like a void had opened up where our life together used to be. I sat on the couch for what felt like hours, replaying every moment of the past few weeks. Every lie, every evasive answer, every time she'd looked me in the eye and told me nothing was wrong. Eventually, I forced myself to move. There was no undoing what had happened, but I couldn't sit in the wreckage forever. I gathered the folder of evidence and tucked it away in the drawer of my desk. It wasn't just a keepsake of betrayal, it was a shield for whatever came next. The following days passed in a blur. I avoided calls from friends and family, unable to explain the unraveling of my marriage. At work, I threw myself into projects, grateful for the distraction. But every time I returned to the house, the weight of her absence hit me all over again. Then, one evening, I found myself at the meeting. It was an Alcoholics Anonymous group I'd seen advertised in town. I wasn't a regular drinker, but after Allison's confession, I'd started leaning on whiskey to numb the pain. The idea of sitting in a circle of strangers, sharing my story, felt awkward at best and humiliating at worst. But something pulled me in that night. The room was small, the kind of place you'd overlook if you weren't searching for it. People sat in a loose circle, their expressions a mix of weariness and hope. I introduced myself with a simple, "Hi, I'm Mark," and for the first time, I told someone what had happened. The words spilled out in fragments, about the parking ticket, the lawyer, the betrayal. I didn't go into detail, but it was enough to make my hands shake. When I finished, a woman across from me spoke up. Her name was Emily. She had warm brown eyes and a voice that felt steady, like an anchor. "I'm sorry you're going through this," she said simply. "But you're here. That's a good start." Over the next few weeks, I kept going back to the meetings, more for the sense of structure than anything else. Emily was always there, always listening. She didn't pry, but she had a way of making me feel like I wasn't drowning. It wasn't until one night after a meeting that we really talked. She lingered as the others left, leaning against the doorframe as I packed up my things. "You're stronger than you think," she said, her gaze steady. "It might not feel like it now, but you'll get through this." Her words struck a chord in me, a small glimmer of hope in the darkness I'd been living in. For the first time since the betrayal, I felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. Not with Allison. Not with the life I thought I had. But with something new. Something better. And maybe, just maybe, someone who saw me for who I really was.